Welcome to the Vashon Heritage Museum History Talks. I'd like to recognize and thank For Culture for their sponsorship of these talks. This evening's presentation is Racism and Japanese Americans, Vashon Perspective. The Japanese American experience on Vashon Island is full of stories of courage and resilience, themes we are inspired to examine. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II and the end of exile and imprisonment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. To talk about their stories and history of racism and Japanese Americans from a Vashon perspective are our speakers. Dr. Joe Okimoto is a retired psychiatrist and has lived on Vashon for the past 16 years. He served on the board of the Friends of Mukai from 2015 to 2020 and continues involvement on various committees. Rita Brogan has worked for many years to advance social equity for women and people of color. On Vashon Island, she serves as president of the Friends of Mukai and was one of the curators for the award-winning Joy and Heartache exhibit for the Vashon Heritage Museum. And joining them is Vashon historian Dr. Bruce Haulman. Dr. Bruce Haulman is a Vashon Islander, a retired professor of history at Green River College, and author of A Brief History of Vashon. And now let's start our presentation.
We'll begin with a couple of definitions of racism. Oxford Dictionary defines racism as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. And when the belief of racial superiority is incorporated into practices, policies, and laws of society, you have systemic or institutional racism.
Institutional racism, discrimination have been part of America's history from the very beginning of our nation's history, starting with Native American conquest to genocide and slavery. And for Asian Americans, the story is similar. Conscription to manual labor, white backlash against those who do not conform to prescribed racial roles. The Chinese were originally recruited to the US to work in timber and on the railroads because there were not enough Native Americans to do the job. But anti-Chinese agitation led to massacres and expulsions of Chinese up and down the West Coast. And the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act meant that Americans needed to turn elsewhere for labor. And ironically, that led to the recruitment of Japanese to fill the labor gap, though they would be ineligible for citizenship. In Washington, Miller Freeman, who is part of the family that founded Bellevue Square, was part of a group that formed the Anti-Japanese League, advocating laws prohibiting aliens from owning land and ultimately ending Japanese immigration to the United States. By the 1930s, Japanese became Seattle's largest ethnic group, and 90% of agricultural works on the east side were Japanese. Executive Order 9066 authorized the expulsion of West Coast Japanese without a trial or hearing, but expulsion did not mean that you could serve in the, did not mean that you couldn't serve in the military or be drafted. In 1943, the War Department announced the formation of a segregated unit of Japanese Americans, the 100th or 442nd Infantry Battalion, in which about 14,000 men fought overall. The 442nd Regiment was the most decorated for its size in the US military history, suffering massive casualties in the European theater. With the December 18, 1944 US Supreme Court decision Ex parte Mitsui Endo, the justices unanimously ruled that the US government could not continue to detain a citizen who was conceitedly loyal to the United States. And on January 2nd, 1945, the War Department followed by rescinding the exclusion orders. In the post-war era was a different age entirely. That era throughout America sparked a new age of activism, including civil rights, feminism, the anti-war movement. America was moving forward and numerous programs were put into place, such as the Voting Rights Act to advance racial and gender equity. Also at this time, the Japanese Americans were trying to restore their lives by proving that they were super Americans. And a number of Japanese American activists, on the other hand, led by JACL, lobbied for restitution and a formal acknowledgement that their rights had been violated. In the beginning, there was bipartisan support in Congress for racial equality, but America's grassroots were divided. And since the election of Donald Trump, we've seen many instances of personal and institutional racism flourish in America.
Now, the Vashon experience, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the 5 eras or 5 time periods when there have been Japanese Americans on Vashon, and hear stories about individual Japanese Americans during each of these eras. The first of these eras is the era of settlement. Next slide. This area of settlement from 1900 to 1920 is really one of hope. People come with hope for new lives and for building new lives and new cultures, if you will. I think there's 3 data points that really tell us a lot about this period for Japanese Americans on Vashon. In 1900, the first Japanese were recorded on Vashon, and there were 7 single young men all working as laborers. 10 years later, there were 97 Japanese Americans on Vashon. 40 were single young men laborers, and 57 were in families. By 1920, there were 89 Japanese Americans on Vashon, 2 single young men and 87 in families. So what you see is a shift from single young men working as laborers to families on Vashon during this 20-year period. And so this change reflected several different things. First was the end of the wage workers' frontier, the idea that young men would come to work in the resource extraction industries, logging, fishing, mining, those kind of things. And that was gradually replaced by families who were farming. The second thing that's reflected here is the end of legal Japanese immigration with the 1908 Gentlemen's Agreement, which limited the immigration of Japanese males, but did not exclude married Japanese females. And so it led to the idea of picture brides, where these single young men would look at a picture book from a marriage broker, pick a bride, and the bride would show up, and they would often not have met, but it becomes the basis of the families that often live on Vashon Island. During this period, the basis of Vashon Japanese American community was formed. In 1907, the Vashon Japanese Association was formed to support Japanese families moving onto the island.
Joe? Joe?
Joe, are you frozen on us? Let me pick Joe. Joe is going to talk about the NISHIYORI family here. So let me fill in a little bit here. NISHIYORI family is an interesting example of these families who settle on Vashon. They come to Vashon in 1907. Yujiro was a businessman in Seattle. He's advised for health reasons to move to the country. They buy a farm and become chicken farmers on Vashon. His wife, Furo, is a picture bride. They're unable to have children. So in the picture top center, you see their adopted son, Yukichi, who was adopted when he was 10 years old and becomes part of the family. Fuyo and Yukichi were both dancers. Fio does traditional Japanese dance. Yukichi really becomes a sort of a Fred Astaire type modern, Cole Porter type dancer. They both teach dance on Vashon and in Seattle. And the family during World War II are exiled and imprisoned, and they lease their farm to one of their neighbors who takes care of the farm during the period of exile. And so when they come back to basically a working farm. So that's the NISHIYORI family story, and represents one example of what happened during this time of early settlement. The next phase from 1920 to 1941 is one of struggle, of establishing a Japanese American community on Vashon. The Japanese American population peaks in 1930 at 139. In 1941, there were 132 Japanese Americans on Vashon. And the emphasis was on families and community formation during this period of the 1920s and 1930s, which led to the emergence of a very strong Japanese American community that became deeply involved in the daily life of the larger island community. Island Japanese Americans contributed significantly to building the first unified island high school and to funding libraries and extracurricular activities in all the island schools. And the Vashon Japanese community also supported Japanese cultural schools for their own children on the weekends, where Japanese language and Japanese culture was taught to the new generation of Nisei, who were American-born citizens because they were born here in the United States.
I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the Mukai family. Many of you know Vashon's Mukai Farm and Garden is on the National Register of Historic Places. The founder of Mukai Farm and Garden, Denichiro Mukai, immigrated from Osaka, Japan, to San Francisco in 1885 at the age of 15. Started off immediately trying to make his way. He was a true entrepreneur, started out living with an American family to learn English, worked as a police investigator, started his own employment agency, and then moved to Seattle after the big earthquake in San Francisco. And over time, he changed his name from Denichiro to Ben, and then to BD. And in 1910, BD and his wife moved to Vashon. Like other immigrant farmers who weren't allowed to purchase property, BD started by leasing plots of land to grow his berries. By the mid-20s, he had built one of the largest strawberry operations on the island. And in 1926, BD purchased 40 acres of land through his 15-year-old son, Masa, who was an American citizen having been born in the US. His innovations in strawberry processing meant that his wealth and influence grew. He designed and built an all-American home with a two-car garage and straight sidewalks, but at the same time, his second wife, Kuni, broke with Japanese patriarchal tradition and designed a Japanese stroll garden, which gained them much fame. They were written up in the Christian Science Monitor. In 1937, as anti-Japanese sentiment increased, BD and Kuni divorced, and BD returned to Japan, leaving the property in Masa's hand. The family self-exiled in Idaho because they had advance notice of the executive order. And they returned to Vashon, but after they returned, the agricultural economy of Vashon did not really revive, and ultimately the property went into disrepair.
The next period is one of trauma, of World War II from 1941 to 1945. And what you see here is this exclusion order, civilian exclusion order number 68. This was posted on Vashon on Tuesday, May 12th. And so it essentially set up a process where on Thursday, 2 days later, May 14th, it required Vashon Japanese Americans to register to be exiled. One family member went to register. They were issued a 5-digit family number with a letter designation for each member of the family. 2 days after that, on Saturday, May 16th, 111 Vashon residents of Japanese ancestry were forcibly removed from the island. Those forcibly removed ranged in age from 1 to 80 years old. Almost 2/3 of them were American citizens. They gathered on the island at the community club, what is now Ober Park, and were met by armed guards with rifles and fixed bayonets. They could only take 2 suitcases and each piece of luggage, and each person had to have a tag with their 5-digit family number. When all had assembled, they were loaded onto army trucks, driven to the North End ferry dock. Many were surprised to see at least 300 of their Vashon neighbors and friends waiting for them there to say a sad farewell. An older ferry pulled up to the dock, and the island Japanese Americans were marched on board along with their soldier guards. By 12:45 p.m., all Japanese Americans on the island were gone. 2/3 of them never returned.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan on December 7, 1941, unleashed a torrent of racism against Japanese Americans in America. Next slide. Here are examples of what prominent leaders were saying. This was traumatic for the Japanese American community, even before the mass trauma of the concentration camps, and it certainly was felt here on Vashon Island.
The concentration camps themselves, when the Vashon Japanese Americans landed in Seattle at the ferry dock, they were marched under armed guards to a waiting train, and then they traveled for 3 days by train to Pinedale in Central California, in the Central California desert. This was May of 1942, when they left cool, lush Vashon. They arrived at what was described by one of them as walking into an oven. The barracks were unfinished, the sewer system was insufficient, dust was everywhere, and there was no privacy. Joe will talk more about his experience. The Vashon Japanese Americans stayed at Pinedale for 3 months. They were then sent to Tule Lake Relocation Center, a concentration camp further north, but still in the California desert. The only positive note was that members of the island community were still together. In February 1943, Tule Lake became an isolation prison for individuals deemed to be disloyal as a result of the loyalty oath, and most islanders were again forced to change locations. The third move effectively shattered Vashon's Japanese American community. A few stayed at Tule Lake, but most of the others were scattered into 7 of the government's 10 concentration camps. Some families had to move up to 5 times before they were finally released 4 years later. The concentration camps where Vashon Japanese were incarcerated are shown as red dots on this map on this slide. So Minidoka, Idaho, imprisoned 49 Japanese residents. Topaz, Utah, imprisoned 9 Vashon residents. Gila River, Arizona, imprisoned 9 Vashon residents. Hart Mountain in Wyoming imprisoned 33 Vashon residents. Jerome, Arkansas, imprisoned 13 Vashon residents, and Rohwer, Arkansas, imprisoned 4 Vashon residents. So Vashon's Japanese American community, unlike many other Japanese American communities that stayed in one camp throughout the war, was shattered and scattered throughout 7 of the 10 camps. This fall of 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the war and the release of Japanese Americans from the concentration camps.
The Matsuda family was one of those families moved from Vashon Island. They came to Vashon Island in 1927 and leased a 10-acre farm and house in the Shawnee Beach area and raised produce that they transported by horse-drawn wagon to a store in Magnolia Beach and to the docks at Burton and Shawnee for sale in Tacoma. The whole family worked on the farm, and seasonal pickers worked at harvest time, and Heskay sold crops in Seattle, Tacoma, Puyallup, and sold their berries to the Mukai fruit-bearing plant as well. So Mary Matsuda was a typical teenage farm girl, 16 years old, when she and her family were expelled from Vashon. She was not able to finish her junior year, but a year later graduated from Tri-County High School at the Tule Lake camp. One of her stories from camp has to do with an evening trip to the communal latrine. She said, "A huge bright light flashed on me, As I thrust my hands in front of my eyes, I realized immediately that the searchlight at the nearby watchtower was focused on me. Guard towers were situated around the internment camps, 20 feet high, and manned by soldiers with machine guns. After Mary's brother, Yoneichi, enlisted in the Army's 442nd Nisei Regimental Combat Team, in 1944, Mary was accepted to the Cadet Nurses Corps. After the war, the siblings returned to Vashon to help with the farm. Mary later joined Group Health, where she founded the Consulting Nurse Program. She's written 2 books. One is called Looking Like the Enemy, is available through the Vashon Heritage Museum.
For Vashon Japanese Americans in the camp, as the war was coming to close, one of the most traumatic events was the burning of the Miyoshi house. On the night of February 8th, 1945, an arson fire totally destroyed the Miyoshi family home and its content, including the stored possessions of the Kanugi, Hoshi, and Takasuka families. The Miyoshi house was the 4th unoccupied Japanese American home that was burned during that week. The Vashon Island News Record newspaper, which was actively supporting Governor Walgren's campaign to prevent the exiled Japanese Americans from returning. And 2 months earlier, the Remember Pearl Harbor League, an anti-Japanese group organized to prevent the exiled and imprisoned Japanese Americans from returning to Washington State, had come to Vashon and distributed pamphlets on the island advocating burning Japanese American-owned homes to prevent them from returning. So what you see here is a picture of the Miyoshi home that was on Morgan Hill. You see a picture of the 2 Miyoshi boys who were both in service in the 442nd at the time, and the headline that 3 Vashon youth admit to burning the Miyoshi house. That headline comes from the Minidoka Irrigator, the newspaper from the Minidoka concentration camp. So the news spread very rapidly throughout the Japanese American community that on Vashon, Japanese Americans may not be welcome back. After the war is a period of what I would like to call resilience, a sort of rebuilding, if you will, from 1945 into the 1970s and 1980s. Nearly 2/3 of the Vashon Japanese Americans who were exiled and imprisoned did not return. The Vashon Japanese Americans who did return to the island were those who owned property. Although they reestablished successful farms for a while, the economics of farming was changing. The Puget Sound region could not compete with cheaper crops grown in California and transported with refrigerated trucks over the new interstate highway system. And at the same time, local farming costs were increasing because of new laws that restricted child labor and that required better living conditions for migrant workers. So beginning in the 1970s, the traditional Japanese American strawberry farms began to disappear, being replaced by U-pick farms and by other crops sold through farm stands and local markets. Many of the Japanese Americans who returned began to find jobs either off the island or in island businesses like construction, engine repair, small businesses, if you will. The last large-scale commercial strawberry pick on Vashon took place at the Matsuda farm in 1985. And by that time, the Japanese American farming community on Vashon had essentially disappeared. Vashon Japanese Americans were still here, but they were no longer farmers.
August Takatsuka, known as Augie, was one of 6 children born to the Takatsuka family who immigrated to Vashon in 1911. They operated a small but modestly successful berry farm. Born in 1921, Augie grew up on the farm and developed a love for farming. He attended Vashon High School and was successful in sports and academics. When he graduated in 1941, he leased land and started to grow strawberries. The executive order of 1942 that led to the exile of Vashon's Japanese Americans interrupted Augie's farming plans even before he was able to harvest his first strawberry crop. He and his family were sent to Tule Lake concentration camp, along with other Japanese Americans from Vashon. Rather than face the future in the camp, Augie volunteered for the military and served in the highly decorated 442nd Infantry. He was awarded a Purple Heart for injuries he sustained in service. At the end of the war, Augie returned to Vashon, one of only 30% of Vashon's Japanese Americans to return. He resumed his passion for farming, but encountered challenges along the way. One such challenge had to do with his migrant labor force. The health department enforced standards regarding living conditions of the migrant workers. Here's part of an interview of Augie by Pam Woodruff on this subject. I quote, "Things were changing. The health department was getting very pushy. To this day, I resent the fact that the health department got all over me, and the same government stuck me in a tar paper cabin with 40 other people when they evacuated us. And now you're telling me if I don't put up a motel-like building, I can't keep these people, these migrants here," end quote. Clearly, this resentment reflected the residual trauma of the concentration camp. But with the changing challenges of agriculture on Vashon, Augie had to continually adjust his crops by switching to growing different berries, holly, and Christmas trees. In the end, he said, quote, "I'm glad I farmed. I've enjoyed farming all along," end quote.
There's a saying that what the son wishes to forget, the grandson wants to remember. Even while Nisei struggled to join the American mainstream by putting the past behind them, even though Japanese strived mightily to be accepted as equal Americans, they still looked different. And their presence was often condensed into stereotypes, often portrayed in media as the Japanese houseboy or gardener, the man-pleasing geisha, or the model minority. Racism is not gone, but today it's easier to embrace ethnic identity. And for the Japanese American community, that identity is changing. Japanese Americans on Vashon today reflect the changing profile of Japanese in America. Nisei elders, third generation Sansei, fourth generation Yonsei, Japanese wives of US servicemen, students, and a growing number of multiracial people with Japanese heritage all live on Vashon. Joe and I are both examples of the 21st century Japanese Americans on Vashon, and we'd like to briefly share with you our personal stories.
My parents, Tameichi Okimoto and Kirie Kumagai, met as students at a Christian Bible college in Tokyo run by America's Oriental Missionary Society. After completing their education, they married and were assigned a parish in Tokyo where they began raising a family. My older brother and sister were born in Tokyo. Soon, my parents agreed to immigrate to America as missionaries to Japanese immigrants along the West Coast. They arrived in San Pedro, California in 1937 with 2 children, a son 2.5 years and a daughter 1 year old. A year later, I was born. Next slide. The bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan in 1941 confronted me with my first encounter with systemic racism. The media was filled with intense anti-Japanese racism, as we've seen in previous slides. There were racist propaganda like this cartoon created by Theodore Geisel, later known as Dr. Seuss. Geisel's work are particularly galling to me because One of the medical schools that I attended was recently renamed Geisel School of Medicine after his family gave millions to the institution. Geisel never acknowledged or apologized for the racism while he was alive. These expressions of systemic racism clearly contributed to the signing of Executive Order 9066 that authorized the mass imprisonment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. 2/3 of us were American citizens. Slide. After the signing of Executive Order, my mother, who was 6 months pregnant with her fourth child at that time, was, as you can imagine, quite stressed having to face this imprisonment. About 2 months after the signing of Executive Order, US soldiers came to arrest us and transport us to the Santa Anita racetrack, where a temporary prison camp for more than 8,000 prisoners was hastily constructed. Horse stalls were converted to living quarters, and barracks were built in the parking lot. Barbed wire and watchtowers with searchlights and machine guns made sure no one escaped. Under these primitive conditions, my mother gave birth to her fourth child, my younger brother. 2 weeks later, we were put on a train to Poston, Arizona, where a permanent concentration camp was built on the reservation of the Colorado River Indian tribes. Here are some facts that speak to the harshness of the conditions of this American concentration camp. Poston is located in a desert in western Arizona, where temperatures range from below 0 in the winter and to 115 degrees in the summer. Rattlesnakes and scorpions call this desert their home. Sandstorms frequented the site, blowing sand and dust through cracks and in the walls and floors of barracks. Barracks were 100 feet in length and were divided by sheets or blankets to form living quarters for 5 families, each family living in roughly 20 by 20 feet quarters. Unfortunately, these slides do not do justice to the actual conditions of the concentration camp. The dividing walls, as you see in the slide, did not reach the roof, leaving a space that ran the entire length of the barrack through which sound could easily travel. There was no privacy in these living quarters, nor was there running water or furniture, except for cots with straw-filled mattresses. Toilet, shower, and laundry facilities in public buildings had to be shared with 300 other prisoners to a block. Meals were eaten in a mess hall where the privacy of a nuclear family was impossible. Life was turned completely upside down, and the structure of the nuclear family severely stressed. We lived in these conditions for 3 years and 4 months. Before our release on September 11, 1945, we lived for 3 years and 4 months before our release on September 11, 1945. Slide. I started my educational career in Poston concentration camp. This photo of my first grade class shows the effect of trauma on the faces of the kids. These are expressions of loss, sadness, and hopelessness. There is not a single smiling face. Being 3 years old at the beginning, I could only cope with these living conditions by blocking everything out from memory, resulting in total amnesia for this time period. This allowed me to survive and move forward, but it left a large hole in my life story. Slide. Upon release from the Poston concentration camp, my family returned to San Diego, where my father resumed his work as minister. We children returned to the public school system and soon encountered anti-Japanese racism. At the start of school, we were called Japs and chased home from school. Sorry. By white students Fortunately, the African-American family next door, the Davises, had children our age who came to our defense. On one occasion, Mr. Davis, a police officer, rescued my father from an encounter with a white neighbor. With a rifle, who was enraged that my father had accidentally run over his dog. But like many Japanese American families, we tried to put the war behind us and put the pieces of our lives together again. For me, that meant pursuing the American dream. At that time, I was too young to know that the American dream would be a Faustian bargain with the devil. I worked hard to pursue the American dream, and with some lucky breaks, I had the opportunity to attend Dartmouth College, Dartmouth Medical School, and Harvard Medical School, receiving an MD degree in 1963. The dedication and effort it took to navigate this course of study did not leave much time for self-reflection. In 1968, I was in the midst of an intense surgical training program at the University of California, San Francisco, when the Black Panther Party exploded onto the national and local scene. The ivory tower of academic surgery could no longer insulate me from what was taking place in the community. And my eyes were opened, finally, to racism in our society. I seriously questioned the direction of my professional life and ultimately decided to leave surgery to find a more meaningful role in medicine. I woke up, as it were, from the American dream. The recognition of systemic racism altered my view of what the dream offered. I saw that it offered an inferior place in an unjust society, and that was no longer a bargain pursuing. Leaving San Francisco for Seattle in 1969, I took to the streets in protest of systemic racism and the Vietnam War in my involvement with the Asian Coalition for Equality. I volunteered as a physician at the Seattle Indian Health Clinic and the International District Health Clinic, as well as the Asian Counseling and Referral Services. Eventually, my search for professional meaning led to psychiatry, where I worked with Asian immigrants at Asian Counseling and established a private practice in 1980 until retirement in 2016. Now in retirement, I feel it is my responsibility to keep the story of the Japanese American alive as a lesson for America today.
In the late 1940s, my father, a young Irish Catholic boy from Brooklyn, joined the Army as part of the transition between the US occupation of Japan and the buildup of the Korean War. My mother said she had never met such a kind man. They fell in love, and Together, they helped rescue her family from the destitute hunger and poverty that befell Japanese people after World War II. They wanted to marry, but were forbidden by the US government until shortly after I was born. On my birth certificate, my race is listed as MONG, period. Mongolian? Mongrel? I do not know. In order to marry, my mother had to swear that she was neither a prostitute nor a pimp. And they were married in a group ceremony of 30 people and then disowned by both of their fathers. So my sister and I became one of the early Hapas. We moved to Virginia, which did not yet recognize interracial marriages. And my mother was confused about which public bathroom she should go to. We did not have the term microaggressions back when I was growing up, but I certainly experienced them, being told by strangers that I must surely be adopted, being complimented on my English, even though I speak no other language, experiencing racial slurs, being taunted by schoolmates, shamed by teachers, and later assaulted by teenage boys. In moving to Hawaii as a junior in high school, I experienced a major revelation when I was suddenly transformed into one of the cool kids from being a social outcast. In Hawaii, Hapa was not considered strange, but there were a whole range of other racially stratified ethnic complexities. And as a result of that, I became very interested in the relationship between ethnic identity and self-esteem, and did a number of studies in that area, but that's another story. I graduated from high school in 1969 at the height of the anti-war movement, right about the time that Joe came up to Seattle. And I threw myself into student activism, ethnic studies, feminism, community advocacy. All of us had such optimism. We thought we could change everything. And my particular passion was for race and gender equality. So it's a really exciting time in this country and in Seattle. I was blessed to have been able to found the Asian Pacific Women's Caucus with Dolores Sabanga, served with Mayumi Tsutakawa as the first co-editors of the International Examiner, and helped create one of the first redevelopment plans for the International District. I was appointed by Governor Dan Evans and then chaired the Washington State Women's Council, and then was appointed by President Carter to the National Commission for Women. See the upper left-hand picture, it's my 25-year-old self with Gloria Steinem and Liz Carpenter with the printed dress, who was the founder of the National Women's Political Caucus. We were involved in working together to organize the 1977 Houston National Women's Conference. Over the years, I started a business. I have a wonderful multi-ethnic family. There's a picture of us in front of the St. Louis Arch. I'm the short one in the picture. And I've really been thoroughly engaged in helping build community on Vashon, especially through the Joy and Heartache exhibit and serving on the Mukai board. As the work of social justice continues to grow, we wanted to highlight some of the issues that are of most pressing concern to the API community, and those include Black Lives Matter, immigration detention, voter suppression, and the current US Census.
Princeton professor Eddie Glaude Jr., in his recent book about race, writes that in order to maintain a racist system, we all must accept a lie. One part of the lie is that people of color are inherently inferior. And the other part is that America is a true democracy. That is, we practice the ideal of all men are created equal. Recently, we have seen more and more evidence that people of color are not treated as equals. We have repeatedly seen police killing unarmed Black men. We've seen our government imprison brown children in cages at our southern borders. And we continue to see higher COVID death rates among people of color. We can only conclude that we are witnessing the lie of equality. And this conclusion is leading us to join protests like the Black Lives Matter. Slide. We see unrest and protests not only in the African American communities, but in many other communities. In 2019, when Trump was planning to imprison more children of immigrants at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a group of Japanese American survivors and descendants of World War II American concentration camps protested against using facilities that were previously used to imprison Japanese Americans during World War II. This was the beginning of Tsuru for Solidarity and the mission to free imprisoned immigrants. In the white community, those who speak of white privilege are exposing the lie of equality and democracy. They acknowledge that whites are afforded privileges not extended to people of color. The lies are being exposed, and people of conscience are realizing that remaining silent is an acceptance of the lies. Will you be silent?
Oops. Did you want to speak to this slide, Joe?
Oh, I did speak to it.
Okay. All right. I must not have been keeping up with you. Slides. The next issue that we'd like to talk about is voter suppression. The 15th Amendment ostensibly paved the way for Black emancipation, meaning full access by all races to our political system that has yet to be realized. The Constitution may have said one thing, but the American South was a place where a multitude of laws were enacted, such as poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent Black people from voting. At the same time, acts of physical and psychological intimidation prevented full social and political participation on a large scale. The literacy tests were also used to test Asian Americans. Japanese Americans were given a literacy test in some instances to determine whether they could be recruited to the United States. But the trick then was you had to fail the literacy test in order to be allowed to come to the United States. But the word got around quickly, and the Japanese who wanted to immigrate quickly learned to fail the literacy test in order to be able to immigrate. Interestingly, when the 19th Amendment was passed 100 years ago, white suffragettes assured Southern senators that they would not need to worry about Black women because Jim Crow was already so effective. But voter suppression was not limited to the South. Elsewhere in America, the alien land laws and other restrictions against citizenship barred people of color from our elective process. And gerrymandering created oddly shaped districts designed to limit the effectiveness of racial, political, and social minorities. The 1965 Federal Voting Rights Act was supposed to end Jim Crow, but it did not end voter suppression. Many of the tools that have been used historically continue to be used. Gerrymandering, for example, if you look at the map on the upper left corner, that is an actual single congressional district in Maryland. It kind of boggles the mind as to how those borders were negotiated. And despite a series of Supreme Court decisions that have upheld equality, we've also found recently that a number of Supreme Court decisions have had the effect of undermining the Voting Rights Act. And we're seeing some alarming new strategies to manipulate election outcomes through stratified misinformation and disinformation, effects to defund the US Post Office, and more. To address these threats, many communities of color have launched voter education and registration initiatives. For example, in Seattle, the Asian Counseling and Referral Service established the Asian Pacific Islander Democracy Initiative, which includes programs to empower immigrant citizens through voter registration and political organizing.
The US Census is always a bit problematic. There's issues of undercounting of ethnic and minority groups. There's miscounts, areas in recording data. It's less than perfect, but it is a valuable data set to understand who we are as Americans. And the data is used for all kinds of political and funding decisions, from appropriating, assigning congressional representation to assigning funding for projects. So the data, while imperfect, is very important. And for us, Vashon is unique in the United States in that we have two census tracts, as you can see in the map here, the blue map, north and south. Those two census tracts have been unchanged for over 130 years. Most census tracts move around and borders, boundaries change as populations move in, areas grow. Vashon, because we're an island, have had consistent sort of census data for over 130 years. What this has done is has allowed us to understand how the island has developed and changed. It's allowed us to understand who is on Vashon and who makes Vashon what it is. And by analyzing the census data, it led us to the creation of the Japanese Presence Project when we sort of found these large Japanese American populations on the island, which then led to the Heritage Museum's Joy and Heartache exhibit, which is now on display at the Mukai House, and ultimately led to this talk. So the census is important. Today, the US Census is under attack by the current administration and by reactionary political forces who do not want us to know who we are, how we are changing, and who we have become as a nation. So every one of us needs to resist this attack and ensure that the census reaches everyone, that it uses culturally appropriate data gathering techniques, and that the census becomes a true reflection of who we are as American people.
Over the decades, Asian Americans have transitioned from one stereotype to another, and Japanese Americans have gone from being a yellow peril to a model minority. At the same time, a lot of gender-related stereotypes have been slower to change, with Asian women stereotyped as hypersexualized and submissive, and men as asexual servants, math nerds, or martial arts experts. Over history, different Asian ethnic groups have fallen in and out of favor with the larger society. But even when this is the case, many Americans have difficulty differentiating between us. And acts of discrimination have ironically not discriminated between ethnic groups. Consequently, during the 60s and 70s and beyond, strong coalitions have grown between Asian ethnic groups to advocate for voting rights, culturally appropriate healthcare, and employment equality. According to the Pew Research Center, while 29% of Asians in America marry non-Asians, closer to 55% of Japanese Americans marry non-Asians, and another 9% marry Asians that are not Japanese. These changes in our community challenge us to consider ethnic identity in more inclusive ways. We do not want the concentration camps to ever happen again. And in understanding our shared history, it is important for us to make the words "never again" ring true today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rita and Joe and Bruce. I'd like to invite everyone to put in questions in the chat. We'd love to hear questions while we have Rita and Joe and Bruce here. So please take a moment and put in your questions.
Well, while we're waiting for some questions from the audience, I would like to just take a moment and to thank Rita and Joe for working together to put this presentation together, to tell your personal stories, and also to thank the Friends of Mukai and the museum for working together to sort of preserve the story of the Japanese American community on Vashon. It's a small story in the larger national story, but it's a very important story, and it's a story that's very instructive to us all. And as you say, never again should be our watchword.
So this is coming from Mia Kronquist. She says, "Thank you all for educating us further. The personal stories really break our hearts, but just reaffirm that we can't allow anything like this to happen again and use our voices to keep fighting for equality. Thank you, thank you." Cliff Marks is also said, "Thought-provoking, thank you." And thank you from Sally and Steve. This was a fabulous presentation. Kay Longi says, "Very moving presentation. Are you generally optimistic about the future regarding discrimination against Pacific Islanders, Asian Pacific Islanders?"
Joe, you want to answer that?
Oh, that's a big question, because I go up and down, back and forth about optimism. But recently, with the movement that Black Lives Matter and the multiracial participation in the protests that have gone on since George Floyd, I think is a hopeful sign. I am worried about the right-wing extremists and what they have up their sleeves as far as the election and post-election time is concerned. And especially since our intelligence people have been suppressed by our current administration. So I think it's a mixed bag.
These are very troubling times, and I think all of us feel that we are on the precipice of danger. And so I certainly would not say that we've declared victory against racism. At the same time, I see some really positive change happening, and part of that change comes from understanding one's own experience and embracing and understanding the significance of one's own experience as having racial implications, and not just being because you're stupid or you're ugly or you're different looking or any of the other things that young people of color are raised to think about themselves. I think there's a greater awareness of the fact that racism does play a major role in how we are raised and how we perceive ourselves. And that's the first step.
Here's a comment from John Okimoto. "Thank you, Joe, Rita, and Bruce. There were stories of Vashon residents that I had not heard about, even though I was born and raised locally. Your personal stories were painful and moving. You made relevant the tragic history to today's climate and the call to action. Thank you. And then John goes on and asks Joe, I'm curious about the Christian church responded. I'm curious how the Christian church responded to the increased discrimination and the imprisonment of innocent Japanese leading up, during up to and during World War II and after World War II. That's a big question.
Yeah, I was a kid during that time, and my father was a minister. I'm not sure that I had the kind of perception and analytic capacity to really respond to that question. The Christian church that my father was part of was started by the Oriental Missionary Society, and it was exclusively Japanese American, and they had two ministers, one a Japanese speaking minister and an English speaking minister. And my father was the Japanese speaking minister. So I'm not sure that the conference, the church conference itself, took any kind of stand against what was happening. I kind of doubt it. I'm reminded of the JACL during that period. And they essentially collaborated with the U.S. government, and they might have made the conditions actually less contentious as a result, but certainly I don't think they actually stood up and protest the incarceration. So.
But to be fair, a number of churches took a stand against the concentration camps. A number of churches also made an effort to provide supplies to internees. Not all churches, but the Quaker Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, all had initiatives aimed to support detainees.
This is a question from Eva Abram to all panelists. As an African American, I have observed that our younger generations tend to want to ignore the past because their generation accepts each other more easily. Does the Japanese community in general have ways of educating the younger generations to continue to build strong identification with their heritage?
Well, that's one of the things we're doing through Mukai, and I know that there are a number of other organizations in the API community dedicated to cultural preservation, to language instruction, to celebrate holidays that are relevant to the API community. That having been said, I think in areas of the United States where Asians really are, one or two people in a high school or whatever, there's less opportunity for those individuals to have a tie to their ethnic heritage unless their parents make a really big point of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also I think it's a very complicated issue, because with the high out marriage rate among Japanese Americans, the younger generation is becoming more and more, quote, diluted in terms of the Japanese culture. So we do see the younger generation wanting to learn more about Japanese culture, which I think is a healthy thing.
Well, and that's why one of the things that I was talking about earlier is the fact that we really have to redefine what it means to be Japanese, or what it means to be Asian Pacific Islander, because there is so much intermarriage. And yet, you know, for people like me and many of my other friends, my other MONG period friends, we have a really strong ethnic identity. And I have never thought of myself as being Caucasian. And my Asian heritage and my culture are at the core of my being, and at the core of our family life. My children are 1/4 Japanese, and they're called kwapas.
So here's a question from, and forgive me, Sarah Giusti. Sorry about what I just did to your last name.
No, you said it right.
Oh, good. Wow, thank you very much for sharing the personal stories of the island families, and especially from Joe and Rita were so rich to hear, and I'm sad and grateful to hear truth. Bruce, you touched on the census data. Could you share more about the makeup of our island?
Sure. I mean, the last census data we have is 2010. That's why the 2020 census that's going on right now, it's so important that we have accurate and data collected and it not be interfered with for political purposes. But what we see on Vashon has always been largely a white Caucasian island. Certainly the Japanese population was a significant, but 5 or 6% of the population in the 1930s and 40s. Today it's changing. The ethnic and minority group population on the island is increasing. Asian Pacific Islanders, so Japanese, Chinese, South Asians, Filipinos are making up a larger percentage of the population that we'll be able to see with this 2020 census data. And then also, I think, the growth of the Latinx community on the island, a population that has grown fairly significantly since 2010, but we don't have accurate numbers on. And that's why it's very, very important for the 2020 census to give us a sense of how Vashon is changing, because it is changing.
Mm-hmm. A couple more here, questions or comments. Joe Badoa, he has no question, but just wants to say thank you for a very moving and informative presentation. It is important.
John Bedoya.
John Bedoya, thank you. Sorry about that. Sorry, John.
Hi, John.
It's important that more people understand that racism has a long and painful history in this country if we are to move beyond this current painful and perilous period in our country. It will require more white people to listen and learn from sessions like this. Thank you, John, very much for saying that. And let's see. Joe, could you describe some of the racial tensions you experienced by your peers and patients while you were working as a surgeon in California? And if you have any children, when did you begin having these discussions with them?
I had a section in this presentation called Face-to-Face with Racism, Personal Encounters. But I kind of scrapped that because in the context of what's happening racially today with the police brutality and etc., it seemed like my encounters were really quite minor. But racism in all forms is a trauma to individual. And so I reluctantly can mention some of the things I was thinking about. I was in a seminar, this was in the 80s. So it was post civil rights movement and so forth. And I was training actually to be a psychoanalyst. And we were in a seminar, and there were a group of us waiting for the professor or the leader to come in, and there were casual conversations going on. And I was talking to somebody on my right, a Caucasian white colleague was on my left talking to someone across the table. And out of the corner of my ear, I don't know why I heard this, but I heard the person across the table ask my colleague, who helped you move this weekend to your new apartment? And just as I turned as he was about to answer, I just turned, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw him take his index fingers to his eyes, and he pushed it upward, making slant eyes. At that moment, I felt as if I was reduced as a person to slant eyes. And here I am, a professional, he's a professional, well-educated. But it's that kind of capacity for a person of color at any moment to have a racist act inflicted.
Yeah, you know, often it's not even, the perpetrator doesn't even realize that they are being racially insensitive. I remember once at a job interview, when the person interviewing me said that there would be a lot of white male PhDs working for me, and he didn't know how they would feel about working for someone like me. And I said something innocuous like, well, you know, I get along with all kinds of people. And he said, yes, you inscrutable Orientals are all alike. You can look at your faces and not tell what you're really thinking. And, you know, he thought he was telling a joke. Mm-hmm. It didn't scar me. It made me mad. It made me, you know, tell him that I didn't think, well, that if he wanted to know what I was thinking, that what I was thinking was I probably wanted to work for somebody else. And I left. But those sorts of what they call the microaggressions, you know, they happen all the time, and often they're not even conscious.
Here's a question from Alan Nakano. Thank you. Joe, you mentioned the Asian Coalition for Equality, the ACE. Can you say something about this? I was part of ACE, but don't remember you.
Oh, hello, Ellen. It's been so long. Yes, well, you know, the Asian Coalition was interesting. They started in the early 70s, and rather than Asian groups being separate, there was an effort to bring Asian groups, the Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean communities together. It was not a large group. but the primary aim was to point out institutional racism. And we supported other active groups, like the Black contractors were protesting the unions preventing minorities from entering the union. And also they were asking the federal government to open up their contracts to minority contractors. And so we as Asians picketed with them. And we also did our own protests about institutional racism within the Asian community. I do remember you, Al, along with Larry Matsuda. And I don't know why you don't remember me, because I was president of the ACE.
So we are at 20 minutes, almost 20 minutes after 8. I know that some people may want to sign off, and that's fine. We can keep going with questions if people would like, if our speakers have time. Here's the question: what percentage of the current Vashon population are people of API descendant?
I can't answer that. You know, we haven't looked at the 2010 census for that API population, but can do that. But what we'll see in the 2020 census, which the data will be available by this time next year, we ought to have, if the census is carried out appropriately, we should have some very good information to answer questions like that. The other thing that's going to be important is for 73 years, census data is locked up. So in 2023, the 1950 census data will become available, the detailed census data, and that gets individual names, occupations, household, you know, all that kind of information, which allowed us up through 1940 to track the Japanese American population on Vashon. So 2020 data becomes available in 2021, 2023, the 1950 census data will be available, and we'll be able to take this one stage further. So looking forward to that, but I don't have a specific answer at this point.
Here's a question. I'm curious how the Japanese reparation legislation came about. Were either of you involved in that, Rita and Joe?
I was not directly involved with it, but it came about, I think in large part because of the leadership of the Japanese American Citizens League. And in 1980, I believe, let me go back. I've got it on the slides. Okay. In 1980, a commission was established to investigate the constitutionality of EO 9066. And the commission then issued a report calling for a presidential apology and a $20,000 restitution to the 60,000 survivors of the concentration camps. But it wasn't until 1988 that President Reagan signed HR 442 into law.
So there are a lot of thank yous and a lot of remembrances that I'll capture and send to you, Rita and Joe. And I was just wondering, for people who are sending us in these conversations, would you like to talk about where people should send send thoughts and comments, should they send them to the Vashon Heritage Museum? We'd be happy to take them. And also Mukai Farms and Garden. Rita, would you like to say anything about?
Yeah, this is a great month for Mukai Farm and Garden. We are in the midst of our virtual Japan festival. It's partly virtual and partially in person. So people are invited to come any day from dawn to dusk to visit, as long as you're being appropriately socially distant, to visit the gardens. But at dusk, the lights come on. And we have a lantern labyrinth that is quite beautiful and eerie to walk through. The Japan Festival will be occurring throughout the month of September. We also have a virtual celebration, virtual festival, which is on the web. And I would encourage you to visit the Mukai website and link to the Japan Festival. One of the things that I want to point out is that we are featuring a brand new Obon dance that was choreographed by Leah Mann that is in celebration or in honor of the souls of those who have departed from COVID. We also have 2 new videos that we're showing on our website. So I would really like you to click on www.mukaifarmandgarden.org.
Thank you all. This is a wonderful presentation to hear. Sad, true, good to know the truth, and very informative. And so there are no more questions coming in. Lots of thank yous, as I said, and unless there's more that you would like to add, I think we can close now.
Thank you very much for hearing our story.
Yes, I second that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. All right. We'll say good night, everyone, and take care.
Bye.
Bye.